One of the things that I've noticed as you and I have gone through this course together is that when we're adding additional vSwitches to the ESXi host, for example, we added one for the VM network, we added a separate switch for the purposes of connecting to the storage network, we added one for vMotion, and we're using the built-in vSwitch 0 for the management network. So that's the only virtual switch that we did not have to create. Now, the big bummer is that we created these vSwitches and we had to do it individually on each of the ESXi hosts. And it gets a little bit worse because if we had to go back and modify, for example, the standard switch policy, maybe the QoS policy, to tweak those, we'd have to go back and tweak them on every single standard switch on every single ESXi host. So one of the solutions to help us avoid having to independently manage each of the switches on each of the hosts is to use a feature called a distributed virtual switch, sometimes seen as VDS for virtual distributed switch. And the big benefit of using a distributed switch is that we can configure this, for example, one time in vCenter, and then we can configure each of the ESXi hosts to effectively buy in, so they can go ahead and leverage that centrally configured and managed virtual switch. So if we need to manipulate port groups or policies and other attributes across our entire switching environment, if all of our ESXi hosts are using the distributed switch, we simply configure the distributed switch and poof, those policies are applied to the distributed switch, which are then being used by each of the ESXi hosts. We avoid having to go to individual standard switches on every single ESXi host as we make changes. We can make them once and they're applied across the board. And in addition to the central management and the convenience that the distributed switch brings to us, there's also some additional features. Things like link aggregation control protocol, the benefit of doing inbound and outbound network I/O control, and several more. And there are some, in the pros and cons category, there are some cons as well. One of the cons is that you have to have an Enterprise Plus license to support it. And one of the other items that's worth mentioning is that if we have a distributed switch, if we make an incorrect configuration on the switch, who's it going to affect? And the answer is all the objects that are participating in using that distributed switch are going to be affected by a misconfiguration. However, in a large environment with dozens and dozens of hosts, the convenience and scalability of using a distributed switch and the time saving of configuring something once, as well as the additional features it brings to the table, those are all big pluses and reasons why people do use distributed switches. So here, my friend, is what I propose we do regarding a demonstration with a distributed switch. Currently, on each of our ESXi hosts, we have a virtual switch 1. And in a previous nugget, when we created that virtual switch, it was for the purpose of our VMs that we were going to place on our new VM network. In fact, the new VM port group we created associated with vSwitch 1 was new dash capital VM underscore capital NETWORK. Which is hard to say and spell at the same time. All right, so we have a vSwitch 1, a standard switch on each ESXi host with this port group, and vSwitch 1 is using vMNIC 5 as the uplink to the outside world. So that represents this gray connection and this gray network down here, the VM network, that each of the ESXi hosts has connectivity to. So here's what I propose we do. Let's create a brand new distributed switch. We'll associate each of the ESXi hosts with that new distributed switch so they can all use it. We'll also associate with the distributed switch each of the ESXi hosts vMNIC 5 to use as uplinks. That instead of being associated with vSwitch 1, the standard switch, we'll associate with the new distributed switch. Now, one of the challenges of that is that we have some VMs on ESXi 2 and ESXi 3, and those VMs are currently using the new VM network port group, which is connected to switch 1, and we're about to yank away the uplink. So we'll also take the step of moving all of the VMs that are currently using the new VM network, and we'll move them to a new distributed switch port group. So when we're done, each of the ESXi hosts is going to have this logical distributed switch in the switching section of networking. They're going to have their vMNIC 5, the uplink of vMNIC 5, associated with that distributed switch. And due to our configuration, the virtual machines will also be associated with the distributed switch port group that's part of that distributed switch that effectively gives them connectivity. And I'll walk you through it step by step, and then you can reinforce what we're learning in this nugget by practicing using the hands-on labs. So logged in here to the vSphere web client, let's go ahead and take a look at our networking as it currently sits before we make the change. So let's click on ESXi3 as an example. With ESXi3 selected, we'll click on Configure. And then from this column right here, let's navigate down to Networking, click on Virtual Switches. And if we need to, we can drag this down a little bit so we can see everything. And let's click on Switch 1 to verify what Switch 1 currently has. So it's got a port group called new-VM network. And if we expand the virtual machines, it lists for us the 2 virtual machines that are currently using that on ESXi3. Also, on this virtual switch, we have an uplink of VMNIC5, and I just wanted to verify what we currently have in place before we swap it all out on each of the hosts with a distributed switch. Now, another location that we can view the VM port groups that are available inside of our data center is we can use the networking icon right here. So if we click on the networking tab, and then we expand the USA folder, and the Las Vegas data center. Here it's showing us our 2 VM port groups. We've got one called VM Network and one called new-VM Network that we created separately. Going back to VM Network, I noticed, and this is really important, I noticed that we have a single virtual machine that's still using it. So we'd want to just be aware that before we ever would get rid, for example, of a VM port group on a standard switch or a distributed port group on a distributed switch, we'd want to make sure that no virtual machines are currently trying to use that VM port group. So here on VM Network, we've got one virtual machine, and if we click on VMs, that'll show us who that virtual machine is. Oh yeah, it's our VMware vCenter Server appliance, and so we definitely don't want to disrupt its connectivity to the management network. And then if we click on the new-VM_network, here are the 4 VMs. It's showing us the VMs because we're on the VMs tab. And with this output here, we can modify these columns. We can right-click on the column header, and then from the drop-down, select Show/Hide Columns, and then we can go ahead and simply choose which columns we want to see. Then click on OK. We can also move these around. For example, if we want to take the used space column here and drag it over to the left, we can organize these in any way that we want to. We can also sort just by clicking on the header to sort that column. Alright, so our goal is to create and implement a distributed switch. So to do that, let's go ahead and click on the Las Vegas Data Center, and then right-click on that object, and from the drop-down, hover over Distributed Switch from the menu, and then click on from the submenu, New Distributed Switch. And we can give it a name. By default, it's going to give it the label of dSwitch, which is fine with me. It's going to put it in the Las Vegas Data Center. Let's click on Next. Now it's asking us if we have any older ESXi hosts. If we have older ESXi hosts, we need to go ahead and find some common ground regarding the flavor of distributed switch we're going to use. In our lab, each of our ESXi hosts is version 6.5, and as a result, we can use the latest and greatest version of the distributed switch. So with that top radio button selected, we'll click on Next. Next, it's asking about the number of uplinks that we want to associate with this distributed switch. So this is something that's a little bit different than a standard switch. Let's draw it out. So let's imagine that this represents our new distributed switch right here. And we're going to have VMs eventually that are going to go ahead and connect to that distributed switch. And the way they connect logically is going to be through a port group. And on a distributed switch, they refer to these port groups as distributed port groups. So if this was a standard switch, it would be referred to as a VM port group, but on a distributed switch, it's referred to as a distributed port group. And for the uplinks, one of the challenges is this distributed switch is just a logical object. It's just an entity in vCenter that we're going to go ahead and tell our ESXi host to go ahead and incorporate. So regarding the uplinks, these are going to be virtualized uplinks, and they're going to be placed in a group. And that group is called the uplink port group. So when we're done with the initial deployment of the distributed switch, we're going to have 2 port groups. We're going to have a distributed port group. That's where the VMs connect here on the left. And we're going to have an uplink port group, which we will, at a subsequent step, associate the actual VM NICs from the ESXi hosts with that uplink port group. And what this question is all about is how many logical uplinks do you want on this distributed switch? If you only need 1, you can put 1. If you think you might use 3 or 4, put 3 or 4. One of the features of the distributed switch is network I/O control. We'll talk more about that later, but if we want it enabled, the default is yes, it's going to be enabled. Fantastic. It's also asking us if we want to create a default port group, and we do. In fact, I'm going to change this name of DPORT group, and let's change that to DS space VM space port space group. Now, it doesn't actually call them VM port groups, but I want to add that name there, and that way when you see it, you'll think, oh, this is the logical port group on the distributed switch that the VMs connect to. So with that in place, we'll click on Next. It's giving us a summary, and then we'll go ahead and click on Finish. And then we can click on Recent Tasks and just verify that it's done. Fantastic. And also, here it shows up in our inventory as well. So we're on the Networking tab in the Navigator section, and there's our vSwitch. If we expand that by using the little arrow to the left of vSwitch, and let's scooch this part over here just a little bit so we can see the entire label. There's our distributed switch VM port group that we can logically connect our VMs to. And this is our uplinks port group, conveniently named vSwitch DV uplinks-261. If we wanted to modify those names, it'd be pretty easy to do so. We just click on vSwitch, and with vSwitch selected, let's go ahead and click on the Networks tab up here. And with Network selected, we have a button here for distributed port groups. There's our DSVM port group, and we have another button for uplink port groups. And if we want to rename this uplink port group, we can right-click on that name. From the drop-down, select Rename, and I suggest that we call this DS for distributed switch uplinks group. And for the lab, when we see it, we'll know exactly what it is, and click OK. So fantastic. We have an uplink port group and a distributed port group. Next, if we click on the VMs tab right here, we can see that currently no virtual machines in vSphere are using the distributed port group. And if we click on the Hosts tab, we can see that no ESXi hosts are yet participating or using that distributed switch. And if we go to the Summary tab for the distributed switch, and then we expand the switch details right here. Now, in actually putting this distributed switch to work, we have three basic things, and they're all very important, that need to happen. Number one, we need to tell the hosts that they should be using this distributed switch. Number two, we need to also associate an uplink from each of the ESXi hosts with the uplink port group on the distributed switch. And based on our plan, we are going to use VMNIC 5, which was associated with vSwitch 1. And that's the VMNIC that we're going to associate with this uplinks group. And then the third step is to go ahead and specify that we want virtual machines that are running on those ESXi hosts to go ahead and connect to the distributed switch port group, in our case it's DSVM port group, to get access to the network. And this is like a band-aid. We could do it fast, or we could do it slow. We could do one piece at a time. And what I like to walk you through is doing it all at once. If you want to break down the individual parts, we certainly can do that as well. And also in the lab environment, if you want to practice different ways of implementing it one step at a time instead of doing it all at once, you're more than welcome to do that as well. And the way we would start is to right-click on the distributed switch, and from the drop-down, we're going to click on Add and Manage Hosts. And we're going to choose this bottom option here, Add Host and Manage Host Networking. So we'll click on the bottom radio button, click on Next. We'd click on New Hosts to add new hosts. I'm going to put a check in the top to select all the ESXi hosts. We'll click OK. And I'm also going to leverage this checkbox at the bottom here, Configure Identical Network Settings on Multiple Hosts, because ESXi 1, 2, and 3 are all going to be using VMNIC 5. And associating that VMNIC with this distributed switch instead of their current vSwitch 1, by using this template option down here, we can basically configure one and have it replicate that on the rest of the ESXi hosts. So with that selected, we'll click on Next. And because we chose that bottom option of do them all the same, it's asking us which one do you want to have to be the example. So let's specify ESXi 1 that we're going to use as a template, and it can simply replicate what we do on ESXi 1 over to ESXi 2 and ESXi 3. Regarding things like moving VMNIC 5 over to the new distributed switch, so with the radio button next to ESXi 1 selected, we'll click Next. And so now we have some options that we can choose regarding migrating everything over. The top option says, do you want to manage physical adapters? We do. We want to specify that VMNIC 5 is no longer going to be associated with the standard switch. It's going to a distributed switch. The next option says, do we want any VM kernel ports to now be associated with this new distributed switch? And to that I say, heck no. I don't want to move any of my infrastructure networking for things like the management network or my iSCSI network or the NFS network. So I'm going to leave VM kernel ports alone here because we don't need to migrate any over. All we're really after is VMNIC 5 from a uplink perspective and some virtual machines, which is our third option down here. Do we want to migrate virtual machine networking over to the new distributed switch? So with the top and bottom checkboxes selected, we'll go ahead and click Next. So because we chose template mode, this box right here represents the VM NIC that we want to use on ESXi1, and then we have the option of applying that change to the respective VM NICs on the other ESXi host as well. So on ESXi1, in this top box right here, let's scroll down just a little bit and click on vmnic 5. So it's confirming for us right here that vmnic 5 is currently associated with vSwitch 1, which is fine. And what we're going to do with that highlighted, we're going to click on this link right here, Assign Uplink. So we'll click on Assign Uplink. And now it's asking us the following question. In your distributed switch, says the wizard, you've got an uplink port group. And that uplink port group, when you created the switch, you specified 2 uplinks. Which of these 2 uplinks would you like to associate vmnic 5 with? So if you cared about which logical uplink vmnic 5 is going to be associated with, you could click the appropriate one, or you can click on Auto Assign. So in our case, I'm going to hard code it as uplink 1. So vmnic 5 on the ESXi host will be logically associated with uplink 1 of the DS uplinks group on the distributed switch. So with uplink 1 selected, we'll go ahead and click OK. And then the question is, where did it go? I can't see it. What we could do is go ahead and scroll up in that top box. It'll show us that vmnic 5, which is currently on vSwitch 1, is going to be associated with uplink 1 on the uplink port group called DS uplinks group. And if that's what we want to have happen on this ESXi host, and it's also what we want to have happen on the other ESXi host in this bottom box here, we can go ahead and click on Apply to All. So effectively, it says, OK, vmnic 5 on ESXi2 is going to be associated with that DS uplinks group. And if we scroll down, it also did the same regarding ESXi3. So with vmnic assigned for all 3 ESXi hosts to the uplinks port group, and specifically uplink 1 of that port group on the distributed switch, we'll click on Next. And next we have an impact analysis screen. If we were yanking out an uplink, for example, from a virtual switch that was supporting iSCSI, and we would no longer have connectivity between our ESXi host and the iSCSI target, it would be great to know about that. So the intention of this screen is to warn us that, hey, you're going to basically cut yourself off if that was the case. Now, because our iSCSI networking is on a different virtual switch, not virtual switch 1, and we're not touching that other virtual switch, and we're not touching the other virtual switch's uplinks, we're not destroying that connectivity, this screen says there should be no impact to that current networking on any of our hosts. So with happy icons all the way down here, we'll click on Next. And next, because we also said we want to migrate VM networking as well, it's asking us which VMs do we want to migrate. And we'll click Next. On this summary page here, it's showing us that we're adding 3 ESXi hosts who will now be aware of the distributed switch, and we're moving over 3 VM NICs. And the question may come up, whoa, Keith, I thought we were just moving 1 VM NIC, vmnic 5. But yeah, we're doing it from each of the ESXi hosts. So that's a total of 3 physical network adapters, vmnic 5, on ESXi 1, 2, and 3. And we'll click on Finish. And then we can click on Recent Tasks to wait for that to complete. Looks like it's done. It configured ESXi 1, 2, and 3. So we'll go ahead and minimize the recent tasks. And on this D switch now, with it selected, if we click on VMs, I don't see any VMs. Let's click on Hosts. Okay, so each of the hosts came in, but I bungled the VMs. None of the VMs came in. If they did, they would show up right here. There are no virtual machines associated with this distributed switch. So if we wanted to, we could go individual VM by VM and change their network to the distributed switch port group. But in a large environment with lots of VMs, that's too tedious to do one by one. So if we do want to migrate just VMs over to the new distributed switch, one way of doing it would be to right-click on the distributed switch, and then from the menu, specify Migrate VMs to another network. And then it's asking us about the source network, so we could browse for this VM port group called new-VM_network. Click on OK. Specify the destination network, browse for it, and we want to go to the distributed port group called DS VM port group. So with that selected for the destination, we'll click OK. So let's click on Next to continue. And now I'm going to choose all virtual machines, all 4 of them, and then click Next. It's giving us a summary saying virtual machines to migrate. There's going to be 4 of them, showing us the source and destination port groups and the number of VMs to migrate. And we'll click on Finish. And now that it's done, that looks much better. For this distributed switch, we have on the Host tab, ESXi 1, 2, and 3 that are all connected to it. We have 4 virtual machines that are using it. And now if we go back to the Host and Clusters tab here in the Navigator window, and we go to, for example, ESXi3, and click on the Configure tab and go down to Networking and click Virtual Switches. Let's bring this down just a little bit as well. You'll notice that here in our list of switches, we have all our standard switches called vSwitch 0, 1, 2, etc. And we have our distributed switch. For the distributed switch, it shows us the DSVM port group here. We can expand that to see the two VMs that are associated with it. These are the two VMs that are hosted on ESXi3. And we have the DS uplink group with uplink 1 and uplink 2. It's currently showing us also that for uplink 1, we have one real network adapter. We can expand that. And this is where it shows us that ESXi3 has its VMNIC5 uplink associated logically with the DS uplinks group, which ultimately provides connectivity from this port group through the distributed switch on ESXi3 out to the external network using VMNIC5. The other thing that we really ought to do before we leave this nugget is verify that it works. Verify that a VM like VM3 or VM4 can access the external network. So let's go ahead and click on the VMs and templates icon here in the Navigator. And let's go ahead and choose VM3. We'll select VM3. And let's right click on VM3. And from the Actions menu, let's go to Power and click Power On. We'll give that a few seconds to power on. And let's also go ahead and open a console to that VM. So we could do it from right-clicking on VM3, clicking here in the little preview of the desktop, or clicking on this icon here as well. All of those options would get us a console. So we'll open up a console to VM3. We can enjoy watching it while it boots. And let's click on the little mousey icon in the top left-hand corner. Click on Terminal Emulator. And in the upper right-hand corner of the terminal emulator, I'm going to hit the plus symbol to make it a little bit bigger. And let's do a ping out to a name. That'll verify that DNS is working. It'll also verify our IP connectivity is working using the ping utility. So let's do a ping out to www.vmware.com and press enter. And that is working. So we'll do a Control-C to stop that ping. And one other thing, let's hit F11 and go back to the vSphere web client. I also want to verify, as we look at the properties for VM3, I want to verify that we are indeed connected to the distributed switch port group, which is reflected right here and right here. And the internet connectivity test verifies that it's all working. So now, my friend, is your opportunity to go ahead and practice in the hands-on labs that we provide and have some fun. And I'll see you in the next nugget. Meanwhile, I hope this has been informative for you, and I'd like to thank you for viewing.